Everyone has bad days, but for the leaders of the nation, those bad days can shape history. Like on August 7th, 1794, when George Washington faced the Whiskey Rebellion. Forced to declare his countrymen traitors and personally lead troops toward battle, it was arguably his worst day in office. How are we defining worst? Using 4 criteria: significant loss or violence, turmoil in politics, adverse immediate impact, and reputational damage. Some worst days felt catastrophic immediately, while the effects of others weren't known until later. Some worst days led to good outcomes, other times less so. Like on July 14th, 1798, when President John Adams signed the Sedition Act, restricting freedom of speech in the name of national security. Thomas Jefferson signed the Embargo Act on December 22nd, 1807. It was intended to avoid war and protect American interests, but instead devastated US trade and crippled the young nation's economy. James Madison was probably wishing he could have avoided war when British forces captured Washington, D.C. and set fire to public buildings, including the Capitol and White House. When James Monroe signed the Missouri Compromise, it was an attempt to balance power between free and slave states, but it revealed deep national divisions, foreshadowing the conflicts that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Imagine signing a bill so unpopular that your own vice president was secretly writing pamphlets against it. That's what President John Quincy Adams did with the so-called Tariff of Abominations, which imposed high tariffs, angered southern states, and contributed to his defeat in the next election. A president's signature can end more than their own candidacy. President Andrew Jackson's on the Indian Removal Act forced the relocation of thousands of Native Americans, causing immense suffering, death, and a deep stain on his legacy and the nation's history. When the banks in New York City ran out of gold, economic anxiety exploded into a national crisis that engulfed the Van Buren administration. William Henry Harrison had a very bad day when he died of pneumonia exactly 1 month after his inauguration, but the government had an awful day too, shaken with a question that, amazingly, at the time, had no agreed answer. Who becomes president if the president dies? It turned out it was his vice president, John Tyler, much to many people's regret. His worst day came when all but one member of his cabinet resigned in protest of vetoes. His party would later expel this sitting president from their ranks, dubbing him his accidency. On May 13, 1846, President James K. Polk declared war on Mexico, sparking not just the controversial Mexican-American War, but also leading to an intensifying conflict between the North and South. It's what some call America's first national political conspiracy theory. After consuming cherries and iced milk on July 4th, President Zachary Taylor fell ill and died 5 days later. Recently plagued by political scandal, his sudden death sparked suspicions of assassination. Speaking of conspiracies, imagine that everyone around you was out to get you. If you were a runaway slave, President Millard Fillmore made that true on his worst day, when he signed the Fugitive Slave Act, requiring all Northerners to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. The small town of Lawrence, Kansas was attacked by pro-slavery forces. The sack of Lawrence fueled the ongoing Bleeding Kansas conflicts, which stemmed directly from President Franklin Pierce's Kansas-Nebraska Act. The pre-war tensions ratcheted again under President Buchanan, when abolitionist John Brown led a raid on Harper's Ferry, hoping to incite a slave rebellion. Buchanan's response to the raid pushed the country closer to catastrophe. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, marking the start of the Civil War. This event plunged the nation into a brutal conflict that would last 4 years, nearly end the Republic, and leave as many as 1 million American lives lost. Every president wants to make history, but on February 24, 1868, Andrew Johnson did it in the worst way, becoming the first president to be impeached. It would have been bad enough when the greed of a few caused a financial panic called Black Friday. It was worse for President Grant, because one of the central conspirators was his brother-in-law. The worst day of the Hayes presidency may have been the first day. After a violent election left both candidates short of the required electors, Hayes secured the presidency through a backroom deal known as the Compromise of 1877, a devil's bargain that ended Reconstruction and led to the disenfranchisement of black voters and the establishment of Jim Crow laws. While walking through a train station, President James Garfield was shot by an assassin who had been denied a government job and personally blamed the president for the rejection. Sadly, Garfield did not live to see the eventual silver lining, the enactment of civil service reform. If President Chester A. Arthur's best day was when he signed those civil service reforms, his worst may have been when he signed the Chinese Exclusion Act. Rather than negotiate with striking railroad workers during a deep economic depression, President Cleveland sent federal troops to remove them. The resulting violent clash left dozens of Americans dead. When President Benjamin Harrison signed the McKinley Tariff, it raised import duties to record levels. It would also contribute to economic instability and lead to huge Republican losses in the midterm elections. President William McKinley was shaking hands with the public when he was shot by an anarchist. Despite initial hopes for his recovery, McKinley died, shocking the nation. His assassin would be shocked by the electric chair just 6 weeks later. Following a night of violence known as the Brownsville Affair, President Roosevelt ordered the discharge without honor of 167 black soldiers, blaming them for a murder despite protestations of their innocence from Booker T. Washington and their own white officers. Roosevelt's many black supporters felt betrayed, and the soldiers were later officially exonerated. President Taft, who had been Roosevelt's vice president, suffered a political blow when Roosevelt announced he was running for president again, specifically citing dissatisfaction with Taft's policies. This split the Republican Party, ultimately leading to Taft's defeat. Racial violence erupted in Chicago during a brutal heat wave after a black teenager was killed for drifting into a whites-only beach area. The ensuing riot, part of the Red Summer, left 38 dead and highlighted President Wilson's troubling attitude and inadequate actions toward racial injustice. Sometimes worse days aren't uncovered until much later, and that was the case for April 7, 1922, when Interior Secretary Albert B. Fall accepted the first bribe in what history would call the Teapot Dome scandal. The widespread corruption wouldn't be exposed until Harding had died in office, but the scandal severely tarnished his legacy. If Harding's worst day came from accepting money, Coolidge's worst may have been when he denied it, vetoing a farm relief bill, which heightened farmers' economic struggles when they needed help most and arguably contributed to the Great Depression. On a day that would become known as Black Thursday, the stock market crash marked the beginning of the Great Depression. President Herbert Hoover's tenure and historical standing would never recover. Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, blindsiding the United States and devastating the Pacific Fleet. When North Korea invaded South Korea, President Truman swiftly authorized U.S. military intervention, notably without congressional approval. Along with significant escalations in Cold War tensions and substantial casualties, the Korean War would also influence U.S. foreign policy for decades. The Suez Crisis began when Israel, followed by Britain and France, invaded Egypt. President Eisenhower's strong opposition to the invasion and a subsequent diplomatic fallout strained relationships with key allies and heightened Cold War tension. On October 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy learned that the Soviet Union had deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba. This event brought the world the closest it has ever been to nuclear Armageddon. The Tet Offensive began with coordinated attacks from North Vietnamese forces, shocking the American public, severely undermining President Johnson's credibility and war strategy, and ultimately leading him to decide against seeking another term. In a televised address to the nation, President Richard Nixon announced his resignation amidst the Watergate scandal, becoming the only U.S. president to resign from office. This event largely dominated and defined his legacy. President Gerald Ford's announcement of a full, free, and absolute pardon of Richard Nixon was intended to help the nation heal and move forward. However, it also led to a significant drop in Ford's approval ratings and widespread public backlash. Operation Eagle Claw, a desperate mission to rescue hostages in Iran, ended with a tragic helicopter accident that killed 8 American servicemen. This disaster severely impacted Carter's presidency and highlighted his inability to resolve the ongoing crisis. When the Iran-Contra scandal broke, it revealed the secret sale of arms to Iran and the illegal funding of Contra rebels in Nicaragua. The scandal damaged President Reagan's credibility and led to a major investigation of his administration. Following his loss to Bill Clinton, President George H.W. Bush pardoned several key figures in the Iran-Contra affair. This controversial act was seen by some as a move to protect himself from potential prosecution. President Bill Clinton was impeached by the House of Representatives for perjury and obstruction of justice related to an extramarital affair, severely impacting his legacy and, some historians believe, contributing to his vice president's defeat in the 2000 presidential election. The worst day of George W. Bush's administration was also one of the darkest in American history. The September 11th attacks cost nearly 3,000 lives and ultimately led the nation into the controversial wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. 2012 was a trying time for the Obama administration. Just months after the deadly attack on the American embassy in Benghazi, the tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School resulted in the deaths of 20 children and 6 adults. It led to a renewed, but ultimately unsuccessful, push for gun control legislation, which Obama cited as his worst failure in office. On January 6, 2021, a mob stormed the U.S. Capitol, disrupting the certification of the 2020 presidential election results. While different interpretations of the day's larger meaning and the president's role in it persist, the images of a Capitol under siege profoundly shook the nation and the world's view of its foremost democracy. During America's chaotic and violent drawdown from the war in Afghanistan, a tragic attack at the Kabul airport claimed the lives of 13 U.S. service members and many Afghan civilians. While polls showed Americans largely supported withdrawing from Afghanistan, the execution was widely seen as disastrous, initiating a decline in Biden's popularity that, as of this recording, his administration has not recovered from.